Let's talk about grammar trees. They're a tool for helping you understand the grammar of sentences, which is useful for understanding what the sentences mean and being able to have sophisticated philosophy discussions, where people say complicated things, and you have to be able to reliably understand what those things mean, and be able to write your own complicated statements and get them correct so that they say what you mean. I'm not going to go over basic grammar in this video, like what a verb is or what a preposition is. If you don't know that, the video might be pretty confusing. I would recommend my grammar article, which goes into more advanced stuff than that, but it also starts very basic, so if you know nothing about grammar, you can use it. But if you know something about grammar, you'll probably still find some parts of it are useful. So there are three standard ways that people do diagrams for grammar. The one that is taught in school sometimes is sentence diagramming. Sentence diagrams look like this. They're not great. They're a lot better than nothing. Compared to having no diagrams at all, sentence diagrams can be really useful and help you understand sentences. However, compared to the two alternatives, they're not very good in terms of concepts and principles. They use too many special cases and have multiple rules about how you do things. The other ones are a lot more elegant with very simple rules. You still have to know grammar, and grammar is complicated, but the actual diagramming part is much simpler for the other methods. So I do not recommend sentence diagrams. What I recommend are dependency grammar diagrams. There are a bunch of different types. The one I primarily use is number C in this chart, the top right one. So that is what I will be doing. All the ones in this chart are okay. You could do them if you wanted to. Being able to do multiple types of diagrams is good. It shows a more flexible understanding. For example, E in particular is kind of nice because if you have a sentence written out, you can just draw some arrows above the sentence and you're done. You don't have to make a tree. So it can be quicker and save you some time. However, it's harder to read. It's harder to see what's going on using E. The other one is called constituency grammar. So among grammar experts, there's two main schools of thought, constituency and dependency. I prefer dependency, but constituency trees are pretty good too, and they have their advantages. The point of dependency is to consider parent-child relationships, which words govern which other words, which ones are children of some other word that they're sort of attached to it and provide extra detail for it. With constituency grammar, the conceptual framework is different, and you look at what is a part and what is a whole. So you take a whole, like a sentence, and then you consider what parts is it made up of. And the sentence is made of a noun phrase and a verb phrase, maybe some other stuff, but in this case just those two. And then what is the noun phrase made of? In this case, there's a determiner, a noun, and a modifier. So it's breaking things down into parts, rather than looking at the relationships of what is dependent on what. And so one of the differences you'll see is that my and dog are siblings in the tree. The determiner and the noun are right next to each other. However, in a dependency tree, my would be a child of dog because it modifies dog and gives more information about dog. It is less important and should be below dog in the hierarchy rather than a peer. And I think that makes conceptual sense. But I do think that building things up from parts also is a reasonable perspective that has some value in it. And if you look at it in detail, constituency and dependency grammar can be very similar, but the ways people actually think about them tend to have some differences because the conceptual idea behind them is different. Anyway, the short answer is I recommend dependency grammar, and I will show you how to make a specific type of tree that I think is the most broadly useful for people. So I'm going to use some color coding. You don't need to memorize this, it'll show up on slides later. So verbs will be green, nouns will be blue, etc. When there's something special, I'll use italics as an extra little indicator. I chose rainbow colors on purpose so that they're very different than each other and they're easy for you to use. So you can use the same colors yourself if you do some grammar work. Because there's only one shade of green and only one shade of blue and so on. So you can use any green for verbs and any blue for nouns. You don't have to worry about using the same shades as me. Just the same basic colors will work fine. So here's the first sentence. Mary had a little lamb. And here is the color-coded tree. The most important word in a clause is the finite verb. So that becomes the root of the tree. It tells us the main idea of the sentence, the thing that is happening, the action of the sentence. Then the subject and object or complement provide additional details. The subject is required in English, although it's occasionally implied, like in commands, where you say go to bed, and there's an implied subject of the person you're talking to. So Mary provides additional detail for the verb had by telling you who is doing the having. And that is why Mary is a child of had. And lamb provides additional detail as well. So the subject is the doer or actor that does the verb, and the object is the thing that receives the action, that the action is done to. So the thing that is had is the lamb, and the haver is Mary. So Mary and lamb are both providing additional information about the verb. And then the modifiers, a and little, both provide additional information about the lamb, so they are children of the lamb. So this sentence has a preposition in it. The prepositional phrase, at the park, modifies sat. It gives us more information about the verb. One of the things that's good about trees is that they represent or show what modifies what. So they help you think about, is at the park a modifier on Joe or on sat? Is it Joe at the park and then he sat? Or is it Joe and he sat and at the park tells us where the sitting happened? Right? You can consider the information at the park could, in theory, modify Joe or sat. It could be telling you where Joe is or where the sitting is happening. In this sentence, it's telling us where the sitting is happening, and the tree shows that. If someone else thought it was a modifier of Joe, they could make a different tree with at being a child of Joe, and then that would clearly explain how they're reading the sentence. Sometimes you might want to give additional information about how a tree works. So at the park as a whole, the whole phrase is a modifier for sat. So you could circle it in orange, the modifier color. And that gives a little bit of extra clarity that that group is functioning as a modifier. Prepositional phrases always function as modifiers, so it's also kind of implied. Also, a common question you might have is, why are park and the out of order? Why did we put the below park instead of above park when in a sentence it's always going to be the first and then park second? And the answer is that the is providing extra details about park. So it is less important. It's not the primary thing. The park is a noun phrase. The primary purpose of it is to go where a noun could go in a sentence. And park is that noun. That is the main point of the phrase. And the is just a subsidiary bit of extra information. All right, this example has an appositive. My tiger is a restatement of Hobbes. You can have two nouns in a row so that the second noun modifies the first noun by restating it. So I italicized tiger because it is doing two jobs at once. So tiger is a noun, it is a thing. However, in the sentence, it is acting like a modifier. So the italics help you note that there is something special about it. This is pretty common in English, where a word is doing two things at once, acting like two different parts of speech, partially. So it's partially like a noun and partially like an adjective. It is more noun-like, which is why I have it in blue. For example, it has the my adjective attached to it, and if it was an adjective, it couldn't have an adjective modify it. So it's still acting like a noun, but it is a noun that we're using for an adjective purpose. So if you want to mark that in your tree, you can put a little dot in the modifier color as a note that is acting kind of like a modifier, or we could use a circle again. That phrase is functioning as a modifier, even though it is a noun phrase. This sentence has an auxiliary verb. The verb is will eat. At least that's one way to look at it. So the more technically correct way that grammarians would do is like this. The finite verb of the sentence is will, and eat is a bare infinitive, which is also called a verbal. The verbals are gerunds, participles, and infinitives. Verbals are words that are based on verbs, but they're doing something else. In this case, eat is a noun, and it's the object of will. However, eat is also acting like a verb. It has sushi as its object. So we could mark eat with the verb color. However, there's a simpler way to handle this. If you don't want to deal with this and learn very much about non-finite verbs, you can do it like this. We'll just take the group and say will eat is functioning as the sentence's verb, and it is good enough. So one of the important things with grammar is you don't have to learn every advanced detail or do it perfectly in order to get a lot of benefit from it. You want to get decent at grammar and know what you're doing, but you don't need to know every advanced rule. You just want a pretty functional, competent understanding. So doing the will eat as one word is going to serve you fine for reading and writing philosophy. You'll be able to understand what sentences say if you think of it with the second model, even though it is not the preferred model for grammarians. So this is a very similar sentence, but I switched the verb to want, and that means the infinitive needs a to. I don't know exactly why. I don't know when infinitives need to, but as a native English speaker, I know that you say will eat or want to eat. With want, you need a to, and with will, you don't. So sometimes infinitives have to in front of them, and sometimes they don't, which is called a to infinitive or a bare infinitive. And I don't really know why it matters or what the difference is. But I wanted to show an example sentence with a to infinitive in it. So the to is called a particle, so it's in the other category. So you can do it like this, and we can mark the eat as being partly verb-like. Another option, we can use to eat as a group. Whenever you have an infinitive with a to, you can just treat it as a single word. That is fine. And again, it is partly like a noun, but partly like a verb. And then third option, you can say want to eat as a whole is the verb. And that is understandable, it is reasonable, it is good enough. You don't need to know the exact details of how those words go together to understand what want to eat means. You can just treat it like a single note. Okay, this sentence has a conjunction, so I'm going to show you how to do a sentence with and in it. There are two clauses here, and they're joined by and. So and is actually the top of the tree, with each of the clauses nested under it. And governs those clauses. It is the more primary thing that comes first. It's the structure that they fit into. Not everyone agrees with this. Some people would handle it differently. I'll show a different way to handle it with a subordinating conjunction later, but I have a strong opinion that this is the correct way to handle coordinating conjunctions. With a coordinating conjunction, the clauses that it conjoins are approximately equal and in importance. And this tree structure makes them approximately equal in importance. They are siblings. Now we have a subordinating conjunction, because. And we can do it just like we did with and. It is the top of the tree, and it joins together the two verbs, and then under the verbs is the rest of each of their clauses. In this case, just a subject and an object. However, I will show you the other way of doing it. Here, we're treating the because clause, because I like meat, as an adverb that modifies bought, so it is nested underneath. We're treating it as less important, which makes some sense because it is a subordinating conjunction, and the subordinate clause is considered less important. However, I prefer the left diagram because both of them are clauses and they are both pretty important. And I think that the second clause, the subordinate clause, is more like a clause than like a modifier. An example of a modifier is the word quickly. It could be I quickly bought steak, and then you'd have a quickly nested under bought. And I think that the subordinate clause is significantly bigger and more important than the word quickly, so I prefer to give it a more important treatment than quickly would get. However, both of these make sense. They should both be understandable to you. And there are other cases where you will put a clause as a modifier, like with relative pronouns. In those cases, the clause actually is acting a lot like a modifier, and it doesn't really make sense not to nest it. I'm not going to go into detail on relative pronouns here. I do talk about it some in my grammar videos that you can buy on Gumroad. So in the second one, you could circle the whole thing because it's acting like a modifier. So this is a fairly simple sentence. It is setting up a similar sentence as an example that we'll get to next. So we have buys, the verb, we've got a subject and an object, and we have some modifiers. Now, what if we have a compound verb? So John buys and eats. He's doing two things. This is a different use of and than the previous one. Previously, and was joining two clauses, but here, and is joining two phrases. And they're just one-word phrases, single verbs, buys and eats. So buys and eats as a whole is a verb phrase that can play the role of a verb. And here is the tree for that. So if you look at where the and is, you can imagine that's where a verb would normally go. But instead, we have the and because the and is combining buys and eats, and the whole thing, and buys and eats, is the verb or verb phrase for the sentence. So the subject and the object are children of the and because the and is the leader of the buys and eats group. It is the representative of that part of the sentence. So this might be a little confusing, so I made a comparison. So we have the simpler sentence where there's only one verb, and then we have the more complicated sentence with two verbs on the right. And you will notice that the structure of the rest of the tree is identical. The one difference is instead of where we have buys, it is now and buys eats. So the green circle on the left has become the green circle on the right. So if you find this unclear or confusing, circling it can make it clearer, where you're showing that this group that you circle is the verb that has John as its subject and food as its object, and frequently as its modifier. So if you liked this, like and subscribe, ring the bell, etc. And you can go to criticalfaliblism.com and sign up for my article emails if you want to learn more stuff from me. The link is in the description. And if you have questions or you want to share your work on grammar, join the forum, which you can find from the critical vowelism link at the top or bottom of the page. I have a discussion forum where you can have philosophy discussions or try to study and learn things.